Although this approach may be productive, inferring cognitive evolution through phylogenetic relatedness can be misleading. Even if different animals appear to possess similar cognitive abilities, these may be mediated by different mechanisms. Wasps, rodents, and birds all display spatial navigational skills when they return to a location where they found food in the past, but they may accomplish this feat in a variety of ways. Some animals may navigate by recreating a mental image of their environment, whereas others may simply approach a cue that, previously, was in the vicinity of the food. In order to navigate effectively, some animals rely on visual cues, some on olfactory cues, and others on magnetic cues. Finding food is critical for survival, so all animals must be able to do this, regardless of the physical traits that they possess, e.g., good or bad eyes, small or large brain, etc. This process, whereby individual species develop different strategies for dealing with the same fitness-related problem, is called common adaptation. Common adaptation is also described as convergence on the same solution through independent evolutionary change. The problem of common adaptation can be addressed, at least partially, by identifying biological mechanisms that mediate a particular cognitive ability. If the same brain processes control the same cognitive traits in different animals, it is more likely that these evolved from a common, perhaps recent, evolutionary ancestor. The rationale for this statement is that cognition is controlled by biological processes that are subject to the same evolutionary pressures as any other biological trait. Natural selection alters wingspan in birds, making flight more or less efficient. The same process alters brain function, making cognitive processing more or less efficient. A less efficient cognitive process is one that uses more resources, primarily brain energy, and is not as accurate in solving an ecological problem, e.g., finding food. A number of other factors could decrease the efficiency of cognitive processing, many of which will be discussed throughout this text. The idea that cross-species comparisons can inform studies of cognition raises the obvious question of how different species are ranked in terms of cognitive abilities. In the past, this question was often posed as, which animal is the most intelligent? Darwin himself was interested in this question, and comparative studies in the early to mid-20th century, early to mid-1900s, attempted to answer it by assessing performance of different animals in the same behavioral paradigm. Bitterman 1965, Harlow 1953. The findings were generally inconclusive, partly because animals rely on different strategies to solve the same task. E.g., some animals have better visual abilities than others, so learning to go through a maze with visual cues would be easier for this species. Also, it was never clear which dependent measure should be the most important, e.g., fewer errors, quicker task completion, or more rapid acquisition in these studies. Other general problems of attributing intelligence to animals, based on what they do in an experiment, are outlined in the discussion of Kohler's work, see box 1.2. Despite these challenges, certain researchers continue to study animal intelligence, promoting the idea that humans are not the only species to possess complex cognitive traits, such as higher-order consciousness, see box 1.4. Box 1.4, Animal Consciousness. Donald Griffin, 1915 to 2003, conducted comparative cognition research long before the term was coined by integrating theories and techniques from biology, psychology, and cognitive science. His original research examined how bats navigate in the dark, 1944. Griffin speculated that bats see by emitting ultrasonic sounds and then listening to the echoes to reveal information about the objects around them. To test this idea, Griffin attached special microphones to the bats and set up vertical wires for them to fly around. By recording the ultrasonics, Griffin confirmed that bats were emitting bursts of sound as they flew, figure 1.10. When he placed earplugs in the bats' ears, the bats were unable to avoid the objects, confirming that they were using echoes to locate and identify objects in their environment. Such information is so precise that bats can use it to find and eat tiny insects. Griffin coined the word echolocation to describe this navigational skill in bats. The discovery was considered a major breakthrough, not only in biology, but also in the development of radar and sonar systems. Griffin even determined that blind people can use a similar strategy to navigate in familiar environments. Figure 1.10, Echolocation in bats. Bats locate and identify objects in the environment by emitting bursts of high-pitched sounds that echo back to the animal. So you can see the bat is sending out bat sonar, which will hit the moth, and then it will return back as an echo of returning sound waves. Despite the advances Griffin made in understanding auditory signaling, the question that intrigued him the most was that of animal consciousness. Griffin echoed Darwin's ideas when he noted that animals, like humans, engage in many complex and goal-directed behaviors. Given this similarity, it is entirely feasible that animals are also aware of their actions, assuming that one accepts humans have this awareness. In his numerous books and articles, Griffin provided examples of foraging behavior, predatory tactics, artifact construction, tool use, and many other abilities, concluding that it is simply impossible to explain what animals do without assuming that they are conscious of their own thoughts and behavior. Griffin, 1992. Many researchers, even those examining cognitive processes in animals, regard Griffin's positions as extreme. Although many may believe that animals possess complex thought processes, they recognize the difficulty of finding an objective measure of consciousness in nonverbal subjects, i.e. animals. Despite the skeptics, Griffin continued to explore the topic, publishing Animal Minds, Beyond Cognition to Consciousness in 2001, just 2 years before his death. By the second half of the 20th century, the second half of the 1900s, researchers began to recognize that intelligence, like cognition, is not a one-dimensional mechanism that varies quantitatively. Rather, it includes a number of attributes that must be assessed in different ways. For example, human intelligence is often assessed in terms of logic, abstract thought, communication, self-awareness, learning, and problem-solving, among others. A more productive approach to cross-species comparisons of intelligence, therefore, is to examine how a particular cognitive process varies across species and how this ability has allowed organisms to adapt to their environment. This, of course, is the approach of this textbook. An interdisciplinary approach. Comparative cognition is an interdisciplinary endeavor with scientists from different fields unified by the common goal of understanding how and why humans and animals process information as they do. This research objective can be approached by rephrasing Tinbergen's 4 questions in terms of cognition. That is, for any cognitive process, e.g., memory or communication, the following questions can be posed. What is its function? How did it develop across evolution? How does it change across the lifespan? What are its underlying mechanisms? These last 2 questions are the purview of scientists in 2 disciplines that are intimately connected to comparative cognition: developmental psychology and behavioral neuroscience. Developmental psychologists study systematic changes that occur from birth to death in humans. Behavioral neuroscientists examine the relationship between brain function and behavior in all animals. The following 2 sections outline some of the ways that developmental psychology and behavioral neuroscience can inform research in comparative cognition and vice versa. Developmental psychology. Many people think of developmental psychology in terms of the changes that occur during infancy and childhood. Certainly, much of the field is focused on these periods because the changes that humans undergo before puberty are truly remarkable. Anyone who has watched young children learn to walk, run, talk, and think for themselves will appreciate this statement. Developmental psychology, however, is not limited to these early stages. It extends across the entire lifespan to include adolescence, adulthood, and aging. Research in this field is often focused on understanding the interactions between nature, including possible innate predispositions, and nurture, experiences, that cause developmental changes. Comparative cognition capitalizes on the fact that development psychology already has a long and established tradition of examining changes in cognition. Research in comparative cognition, in turn, builds on knowledge in developmental psychology by comparing the cognitive abilities of infants and children to those of other animals. These studies can be used to address a variety of questions that are the cornerstone of comparative cognition. For example, what cognitive capacities can exist in the absence of language? How do we define the biological predispositions and environmental conditions that influence what learning occurs? What is the evolutionary lineage of different cognitive processes? Although research in animal cognition and human cognitive development has often delved into the same questions, only recently has there been an increase in collaborative work between the two disciplines. One problem was that developmental psychology and comparative cognition frequently employed different experimental procedures, making it difficult to compare results from the two sets of studies. This changed over the last decade, with an increasing number of experimental studies that directly compare cognitive abilities of children and animals using very similar methodologies. For example, in the study of numerical cognition, a topic that will be discussed in Chapter 6, research focused on counting processes has benefited from dialogue and collaboration between those who traditionally study the cognitive development of human infants and those who examine animal cognition. In some cases, methodologies have been shared. Infants have been tested using measures originally designed for rhesus monkeys, Macaca mulata, e.g. Friggson et al. 2002, and, in other cases, monkeys have been examined with procedures that were previously developed for use with infants, e.g. Hauser and Carey 2003. Through these studies, and many others like them, new theories on the cognitive mechanisms allowing for number representation have been developed. Importantly, the foundations of these abilities appear to be common across many different animal species. Behavioral neuroscience. There are two factors that make comparative cognition and behavioral neuroscience complementary sciences. First, cognitive processes are mediated by biological systems, most notably the brain, and second, cognition must be measured indirectly through behavioral responses. Thus, the study of brain-behavior relationships, i.e. behavioral neuroscience, can inform comparative cognition research on a number of levels. As an example, neuroscience techniques are commonly employed to examine the mechanisms underlying specific cognitive abilities. These include manipulations of brain systems via lesions, electrical stimulation, and pharmacological activation. As well, brain activity may be monitored through brain imaging, electrophysiology, and measures of neurotransmitter release. Research using these techniques has provided detailed information on the proximate causes of many cognitive functions, such as perception and attention. See Chapter 2 for details. That is, behavioral neuroscientists have traced how sensory information is relayed from the environment to the nervous system, how it is processed in the brain, and how this information controls responding to incoming sensory stimuli. Behavioral neuroscience can also address ultimate causes of cognition by comparing central nervous system function across species. This often occurs within the subfield of neuroethology, the study of how the nervous system controls natural behavior. A premise of this field is that the nervous system evolved to solve fitness-related problems, so cross-species differences in brain morphology and function can be best understood in the context of adaptive traits. These comparative studies are informative because, despite differences in gross neuroanatomy, i.e. overall brain structure, there are widespread similarities in the nervous system of all animals. These include the structure and function of neurons, nerve cells, how neurons communicate with each other, and how proteins are formed within neurons. Moreover, developmental processes such as neuronal growth are preserved across species, at least in animals with an organized central nervous system. If similar brain systems underlie the same cognitive process in different animals, it would suggest that the mechanisms that mediate this process have been preserved across evolution. Fundamental processes, such as the ability to associate environmental stimuli with motivationally significant events, may fall into this category. Other cognitive processes appear to be mediated by distinct physiological mechanisms in different animals. For example, most animals transmit information to conspecifics, discussed in Chapter 12, but the nature of the transmission varies dramatically. It can range from the production of auditory signals by the vocal cords in humans to the emission of pheromones by insects. Pheromones are chemicals released by one animal that are used as a scent signal by another animal, usually one of the same species. The ability to convey information, either about environmental dangers or resources, would enhance survival of a species, so communication evolved in many animals despite dramatic differences in body structure and neuronal architecture. Not surprisingly, our knowledge of the neural basis of cognition varies widely depending on the cognitive process under investigation. As outlined in Chapter 4, scientists have detailed the biological mechanisms involved in associative learning, from brain systems to cellular changes to molecular signaling to genetic alterations that may mediate this process. In contrast, most have little understanding of how the brain controls social cognition. Although research in this field, social cognitive neuroscience, is progressing rapidly. In addition to uncovering the biological basis of cognitive processes, understanding how the brain operates can help scientists to refine cognitive theories of behavior. One may speculate on how cognition works by developing elaborate models of information processing, but these theories would be implausible if they did not account for the physical constraints of brain function. It is known, for example, that neurons transmit information in one direction only. A model of memory that proposes backpropagation to form associations would be untenable. Other brain properties, such as neurotransmitter communication, anatomical connections, or neuronal firing patterns, must be taken into account in any theory that provides either proximate or ultimate explanations of cognition. Future directions. Comparative cognition is now firmly established as a discipline devoted to understanding cognition from a variety of perspectives. Since its inception in the late 20th century, the late 1900s, the number of species studied in comparative cognition research has expanded, a trend that is likely to continue in the future. Shuttleworth, 2010. This represents a clear advance in the field, leading to an increased understanding of how specific cognitive traits vary across species. This information can then be used to develop theories of cognitive evolution, particularly as scientists continue to develop better tools for comparing phylogenetic relationships across species. The influence of both developmental psychology and behavioral neuroscience on comparative cognition research will likely expand as communication between disciplines continues to grow. Originally, comparative cognition researchers adopted test paradigms from developmental psychology that allowed them to examine cognitive processes in nonverbal subjects. This crosstalk is now moving from methodological to theoretical questions as researchers begin to appreciate how developmental processes may be applied to phylogenetic questions. Behavioral neuroscience is growing as psychologists in related areas, e.g., social, cognitive, and clinical, incorporate more and more biological measures and theories into their work. Paralleling this shift, behavioral ecology is increasingly characterized by the study of brain-behavior relationships. Given these trends, comparative neurophysiology may become an important endeavor in the future. Danchin et al., 2008, complementing work in comparative cognition. In all likelihood, the emerging discipline of neuroeconomics, studying neural systems that control mental computations, will have an important role to play in future advances in this field. Finally, advances in comparative cognition are somewhat paradoxical in that they highlight cross-species commonalities in thought, emotion, and behavior. If other species are more similar to humans than originally thought, it raises the issue of how and when animals should be used in scientific research. even observational studies. Although the debate is ongoing, many people agree that the benefits accrued from this work, both for humans and animals, far outweigh the potential costs. Currently, research institutes must adhere to strict regulations on the ethical treatment of non-human subjects, both those that are tested in the lab and in the natural environment. In addition to medical advances based on animal models of disease states, research using animal subjects has improved the welfare and conservation of animals in both the natural environment and in captivity. Dawkins, 2006. Finally, like many fields, basic science research in comparative cognition often leads to practical applications that were not immediately apparent when the research was being conducted. Chapter Summary. Researchers in the field of comparative cognition study a wide diversity of species, employ a variety of methodologies, and conduct their work within many different academic and research departments. Nonetheless, the field is characterized by three unifying hallmarks: a focus on cognition, defined as the acquisition, storage, and processing of mental information; an experimental methodology, either in the lab or the natural environment; and an explanation of research findings within the framework of evolutionary theory. The basic tenets of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection can be simplified to the following 3 points. Variation, i.e., individuals within a species display variability in both physiological and behavioral traits. Heritability, i.e., offspring inherit traits from their parents. And survival and reproduction, i.e., individuals possessing a trait that promotes survival or reproduction will have a greater chance of transmitting traits to their offspring. A premise of comparative cognition research is that cognitive traits are shaped by the same evolutionary pressures, i.e., natural selection, that shape physiological traits. Despite the widespread influence of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, many scientists criticized Darwin's consideration of animal thinking, noting that he relied heavily on anecdotal evidence to formulate these ideas, rather than tightly controlled experiments. Under this banner, a subdiscipline of psychology, behaviorism, flourished in the first half of the 20th century, the first half of the 1900s, and focused on behavior, e.g., learned responses, instead of mentalistic states. During the same period that psychologists were examining learned responses in the lab, many ethologists were studying behavior, primarily by observing animals in their natural environment. Tinbergen, who was one of the pioneers in the field, formulated the 4 questions of ethology as a means to understand a particular behavior. These can be divided into ultimate, functional, adaptive, and proximate, developmental, mechanistic explanations. As a response to what was seen as a focus on proximate causes by ethologists, another discipline developed, behavioral ecology, which focused on ultimate explanations of behavior. Comparative cognition emerged out of 2 traditional sciences, psychology and zoology, or more specifically, behaviorism and behavioral ecology. Additionally, an emphasis on cognition arose within the field of psychology as researchers reacted to the limitations of behaviorism and began to accept ideas put forth by linguists and computer scientists regarding mental processes and representations. The contemporary field of comparative cognition is an interdisciplinary endeavor with scientists from different fields unified by the common goal of understanding how and why humans and animals process information. The field has advanced through interactions with other researchers, such as developmental psychologists and behavioral neuroscientists. Footnote: Life on Earth is classified according to a biological taxonomy, originally developed in the 18th century, in the 1700s, by Carl Linnaeus. See Chapter 9 for details. The system divides living organisms into progressively smaller groups based on shared physical traits, according to the following scheme: domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Humans would be classified as follows: Eukarya, domain; Animalia, kingdom; Chordata, phylum; Mammalia, class, primates, order, Hominidae, family, Homo, genus, and sapiens, species. An organism's scientific name, also called the binomial name, consists of the genus and species, which are usually derived from a Latin or Greek root. These are written in italics with the genus name capitalized. Thus, humans are Homo sapiens. According to this classification, humans are part of the kingdom Animalia, but for succinctness, this book will use the term animal to refer to all non-human animals and human to refer to Homo sapiens. In addition, the scientific name will be provided in parentheses the first time that a species is mentioned in each chapter.